All right, we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Kathy Chan, and I am the acting director of the University of Victoria's Center for Studies in Religion and Society for the 22-23 academic year. So welcome to what I believe is our 17th public lecture for this calendar season. I'd like to open this proceeding by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are holding this lecture series, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who have continuing historical relationships with this land. And I'm very pleased today to introduce one of our graduate student cohort, Jessica Ziakin-Cook. Jessica is an MA student in history at the University of Victoria and the recipient of the Heather J. Lindstedt and Brian Pollick Graduate Student Fellowship for 2022-23. So I'm glad that Brian Pollick can be with us here today. Welcome, and I'm very happy to welcome Jessica to deliver her lecture on sacramentalism and modern art in the interwar period. So welcome.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Brian. And I just have to say, this is a bit of a dream come true. I used to bring a discussion group on field trips up here to the Thursday lectures. So to be behind the lectern is kind of amazing after maybe as much as 10 years of following what's happening here at the center. So yes, I'd love to talk to you tonight, and I'm going to try and keep it in time, on the outward and visible signs, or sacramentalism, spirituality, and modern art. And I'd like to start with a couple acknowledgements. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisor, Alan Antliff, who has encouraged me in my studies and sees more in me than I see in myself. And I'm think we'll be eternally grateful for that. I'd also like to thank my committee member, Catherine Harding, who has been nurturing my interest in theology, even though I'm kind of hiding out in the art history and visual studies department. So I'm grateful to Catherine and her interdisciplinary openness. As Kathy acknowledged, I'd also like to acknowledge the land where we gather and where I actually have grown up and had a lot of formation myself at the Garry Oak Meadows, and I'm grateful also to the Lekwungen people and First Nations for teaching us this protocol of acknowledgements, because it's helped me deal with a major thorn in my side in my research here, which is the real harm caused by sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And that was or has been perpetrated by ordained and lay ministers, including Eric Gill, one of the artists we'll discuss tonight. So I don't want to pull any punches, and I don't want to hide anything from you. I'm looking at a gospel book, and if you go home and start Googling Eric Gill, you will be very surprised at some of the things that you find. So as I said, I'm grateful to the First Nations for teaching us how to not turn away from the harder things in history and instead bring it along into the conversation. So a couple of definitions before I really get started and let you know where I'm coming from. I applied to the center thinking about Simone Weil and another British artist, Cecil Collins. And as I looked into the two, there seemed to be so many commonalities. Simone Weil being French Catholic, Cecil Collins being English, Anglicanish kind of person. I was thinking, what's this cross-channel coincidence? And I thought, I've got to go upstream. There's something else there. And what I found upstream about 30 years was Jacques Maritain, the French Catholic philosopher. So that's why my talk today won't necessarily touch on Simone Weil or Cecil Collins, but it's definitely of a piece in my research. And so in terms of some definitions, I wanted to say first that I wanted to talk just very briefly about theology and spirituality and try and tease those apart a little bit. I would argue, and I'm following the medieval art historian Margaret Miles, as well as the Anglo-Catholic theologian Kenneth Leach, and say that The process of examining and communicating a personal spiritual experience. So spiritual experience would be something that's personal, internal, that kind of encounter with the divine or the absolute. The process of examining that and then trying to communicate it to others is the beginning of theological inquiry. So I'm using theology in what I would call lowercase t theology to say anything that is an assertion about the nature of God or about humankind or the world. Now, these theologies that get expressed then, go into the group and get sussed out, and you end up with a doctrine or a capital T theology. So you have the theology of the incarnation, for instance, in Anglo-Catholicism. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that because those words will come up. But spirituality, I argue, is the kind of the personal experience, and then theology is when it gets brought to the group and sussed out. And the two have historically have had a mutually beneficial or integral relationship, but ecclesial historians have talked about how they've been separated since the Enlightenment. So the two kind of seem like they're distinct, but they actually inform one another. So this, and building on Margaret Miles, I'd also like to say that then the doctrines that make up a theological tradition provide frameworks and epistemologies to its community of believers that organizes their worldview and shapes their emotional lives. So the theology actually and the art shapes how people interpret the world. So this essay explores a particular theological tradition, Anglo-Catholicism, and its insights into art's potential role in critiquing modernity and industrialism. So at the heart of my presentation is this gospel book by the artist Eric Gill, and I have a facsimile here that you're welcome to thumb through and look at, and a couple pages that could be passed around. The English artist Eric Gill and architect Arthur Penty were neighbors at Little Ditchling in Sussex from 1920 to 1924. Little Ditchling was an intentional community set up by Gill in which artisans lived, worked, and prayed together, fusing life, art, and worship into one. The Ditchling community grew up around the Guild of St. Joseph and St. Dominic, which was co-founded by Gill in 1921 and based on Penty's theoretical model of societal renewal known as Guild socialism. Penty's overall philosophy of post-industrialism, the concept that industrialism is so dysfunctional that its collapse is imminent, advocated for a medievalism on economic and spiritual grounds. The group's handbook for a deeper theological argument was Jacques Maritain's work, Art and Scholasticism, originally published in French in 1920. It was published in English as The Philosophy of Art by Gill's own St. Dominic's Press in 1923. A study of this text and Gill's masterpiece shown here, The Four Gospels of the Lord Jesus Christ, which was published in 1931, will help us understand the post-industrial theology of art and creative labor. The purpose of this lecture is to consider Gill's masterwork, The Four Gospels, and ask, why this artwork at this time? I will argue that Penty, Gill, and Maritain shared similar concerns. They sought a way to bring forward the spiritual issues underlying the social crises caused by modern industrialism, arguing a revitalization of arts and crafts could lead to social and spiritual freedom. Gill's Four Gospels has been admired by bibliophiles and typographers for almost 100 years, but very little has been written on its iconographical content and social significance. One explanation for this lacuna is what scholars such as Charlene Spretnak and Thomas Crow are calling, quote, the reigning interdiction on theology in modern art history, unquote. So Cave and Mason's history of the Golden Cockerel Press, the press which published this gospel book, makes an invaluable contribution to our understanding of the production of the Four Gospels, but it does not explore the iconographic or post-industrial dimensions. On the other hand, theologian John Hughes has a lot to offer in his work, The End of Work, in which he unpacks Gill's relationship with Maritain, but says nothing about Gill's artwork. So I would like to try and address this, bridge this gap in this paper. With regards to this thinking of how the role of theology might fit back into the discipline of art history, James Elkins suggests one method might be the telling of, quote, alternative modernisms. By exploring the alternative modernism of post-industrialism, I wish to show how its distinct Anglo-Catholic theology impacted arts and crafts production in the late modern period. This is what Susie Gablick calls rear guard action, as opposed to avant-garde action. This activity I'm doing and fills in the details on abandoned and forgotten or taken for granted cultural forms in order to aid a more participatory social aesthetic. The modern Anglo-Catholic artists I will examine in this paper, Arthur Penty and Eric Gill, were interested in art and craft as vocational responsibilities and social responsibilities. And they were careful examiners of the metaphysical mechanics at play between religion, economics, and the arts. They saw that art not only had a role to play in times of crisis, they saw it as a central solution to the crises they faced in the period between World War I and World War II. My visual analysis will reveal Maritain's influence on Gill's conception of art and how it intersects in Gill's work with the book's production as a post-industrialist exercise that was integral to his ideological message. How this came to be manifest at the Golden Cockerel Press will be part of tonight's story. Why would a modern artist in an increasingly secular age create a medieval-ish style book? But furthermore, I also would like to argue that a history of this object is not complete without an exploration of how the iconography of the four Gospels and Gill's ideological commitments are linked theologically. For Gil, Maritain provided a medieval philosophical structure for his understanding of the salvific power of art making and his effort to develop a new symbolic vocabulary to support the restitution of a post-industrial common culture. So the first part of this paper will explore the post-industrial Anglo-Catholicism during the four Gospels. This theological core of Gill's thought is important because it accounts for the depth and breadth of his critique and informs his method of artistic production. So what is Anglo-Catholicism? The Anglo-Catholic imagination is a sacramental view of the world, one in which matter is considered to be sacred, or a veil of the sacred, and sensory beauty is the language of worship. In addition to bringing back candlesticks, vestments, and polyphonic music, Anglo-Catholics also sought to make material and spiritual difference in the lives of urban populations by building churches of reverential beauty, such as All Saints Margaret Street in London, pictured here. Completed in 1859 by the Anglo-Catholic architect William Butterfield, this church is based on the notion of honesty in materials and is full of hand-wrought craft, such as stained glass, Tudor-style woodworking, glazed tile work, and William Morris wallpapers. To invite fully embodied worship, there are cues for each of the senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Through the theology of the Incarnation, the 7 Catholic sacraments, baptism, communion, confirmation, confession, marriage, anointing the sick, and ordination, are understood to be material expressions of the spiritual, or as St. Augustine called them, outward visible signs of an inward invisible faith. Anglo-Catholics generalize this principle and see themselves as committing outward visible signs of the sacred in art and architecture, social justice, liturgy, and even everyday chores done well. By the 1920s and 30s, Anglo-Catholicism boasted adherents such as T.S. Eliot, G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Underhill, Vita Scudder, and Bishop Charles Gore. By then, a sacramental understanding of art and labor guided this circle of Anglo-Catholic and Roman Catholic thinkers and artists into a strident critique of industrialism. It engendered an arts-based solution to the social crises of modernism. This critique, based on their belief in the sacred dignity of humankind, which Eugene McCarahar describes as sacramental humanism, led them to an anti-industrialist position. As Gil put it, "I believe that capitalism is robbery, industrialism is blasphemy, and war is murder." Let us consider this milieu and its influence on Gil and the development of the post-industrial worldview. The interwar period was marked by a pointed public debate about what was broadly referred to as the social crisis. This crisis, or set of crises, including urban poverty, social unrest, and income inequality, and to top it all off, World War I, developed in tandem with the Industrial Revolution and had been a topic of hand-wringing well before the First World War, for English Romantics in particular. But after the war, the need to address the soul-crushing progression of industrial capitalism and communism was clarified and became more urgent. Post-industrialism's chief theorist, Arthur Penty, claimed that the roots of the social crisis derived from the rise of materialist society and the concomitant denial of the spiritual core of human existence. Anglo-Catholics, in Bishop Gore's words, demanded, quote, "a form and ideal of society which shall secure for the individual his spiritual liberty," unquote. The solution promoted by Anglo-Catholics was a return to the theocentric social order, a model for which might be found in Guild socialism. One of the most prolific thinkers dedicated to this cause was Arthur Penty, an architect who worked in London during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Trained as an apprentice in his father's architecture firm, he lacked any formal education, but as a young autodidact, he became a disciple of the 19th century artists John Ruskin and William Morris, founders of the British arts and crafts movement. Like Morris, Penty rejected capitalism and looked to the medieval era as an age in which, to his mind at least, art, economics, and faith were integrated. He averred, for instance, that the medieval conception of the social order rested upon the constitutive principle of unity, underlying and comprehending the world's plurality. The medievalists, quote, accepted in the visible world a plurality of temporal powers, supported and sustained by the indivisible unity of the spiritual power, unquote. So for instance, here we have some watercolors by John Ruskin when he visited Venice. He went on the Grand Tour many times, and Venice became a quintessential touchstone for what the medieval world must have been like. And what we see here, if we can, yes, my pointer here, you see this colonnade with these capitals. Every capital here, I don't know if it's clear to you, is slightly different. This is not the same acanthus leaves every single time at 45-degree angles. Each one is slightly different because the workman, the craftsman was trusted to, within the parameters of the scale and the number of columns needed, he was free to decorate them as he would. You can see here too that these roundels on each level are different. And so there's this, in the nature of the Gothic, Ruskin talks about how there's the Gothic and the medieval world had, the worker was free. He was free to take joy in his creative labors. And he spoke extremely disdainfully about modern architecture and how it's like a barometer for the social well-being, the spiritual well-being of a society. If the workers aren't free to express themselves or engage in creative labor, you have a sick society. So this is what Ruskin was working on in the 19th century, and the guys I'm thinking about now are a couple generations down the road in the 20th century. Like Ruskin, actually we'll go back, Penty's philosophy of art was centered around laborers' spiritual need to take joy in their work and developed the call for a revival of medieval economic principles and practices in the form of craft guilds. The starting place for the practical theory This was his starting place for a practical theory of contemporary social reform. He wrote in his book, PostIndustrialism, quote, "The evidence that industrialism is a blind alley from which we must retrace our steps or perish becomes more conclusive every day. Once we understand these things, we begin to understand the significance of medievalism. Its roots are not to be found in any idealization of the past, as our critics ignorantly suppose, but in frankly facing the facts of the present. For once the human mind finds itself unable to contemplate the future of industrialism with equanimity, it inevitably turns to the past. Such being the case, medievalism is not romanticism, but the last word in utilitarianism, as all must sooner or later find out. Its value as an ideal is that it provides a convenient rallying point from which the root fallacies of our civilization may be attacked. For an interest in fundamental things inevitably creates an interest in medievalism, for in it the beginnings and the origin of things that exist today are to be found," unquote. Penty believed that craftsmanship could not survive in a capitalist economy because of the pressure to produce items at the lowest acceptable standard, cheaply and in high quantity. This led him to the conclusion that given the central role of work in human life, capitalist industrialism was bound to collapse, and a return to the medieval-style guilds and craft-based production was inevitable, as well as practical. We can discern the intersection with his sacramental worldview when he states, quote, "For though it may be admitted that the present distribution of wealth involving extremes of riches and poverty is an evil of the first magnitude, such maldistribution is yet only the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual disease." Post-industrialism, a term that Penty borrowed from Ananda Coomaraswamy, refers to, quote, "the state of society that will follow the breakup of industrialism, and might therefore be used to cover the speculations of all who recognize industrialism is doomed," unquote. Coomaraswamy and Penty argued that in the guild system, there was no subdivision of labor as there is in a factory. Rather, artisans were trained in the whole of a craft. They inherited a vocabulary of forms and techniques from the craftspeople before them, passed down within the community. These skills and related aesthetic values and the social relationships they engendered constituted culture. Penty's philosophy of art then was based on this vision of a common artisanal culture. To his mind, art flourishes when society, based on shared religious belief, finds the right balance between the material and the sacred. Artists, to his mind, as well as Gills, are not oracles or supreme geniuses, but a broad category of craftspeople who work within a rich tradition slowly developed by those who came before. After World War I, Penty would forcefully reiterate this argument as a solution to the manifest social crisis. Quote, "The links which bound culture and life are broken, and they cannot be repaired so long as man remains a slave of the machine. And so all art and culture disappear from life, for it cannot be kept alive by the few. All must share in it or none. If any art is to revive, it must be an art that is the common possession of the whole people, and such an art cannot be grafted on a machine society." So we can now see how guild socialism can be construed as a social model that affirms the spiritual and material aspects of labor. And I'd remind you, we're talking about guild socialism because Eric Gill, the maker of this book, set up a guild, right? And he did it 2 or 3 times throughout the course of his working career. Penty and Gill linked guild socialism to the cause of a new Christendom, modeled on the theocentric order of the Middle Ages, when the church held Europe in some real recognition of fellowship, quote, "in which all men were bound to justice and to the recognition of their spiritual equality before God," unquote. As Gill in 1939 summarized, "We've spent untold energy proving the general beastliness, vulgarity, inefficiency, antisocialness, and ugliness of the industrial capitalist commercial world. Now we've got to show them that the ultimate ground of our objection is something quite different from what they suppose. We've got to show them that it's not beauty, as they understand it, which we accuse them of destroying, though they do destroy it, but holiness in man and in all his works. Gill, a stonecutter, typographer, man of letters, and Catholic anarchist, did not call himself an artist. He considered himself a maker of church furniture. Gill's conversion to Catholicism and ordination into the Dominican order brought him in touch with the Reverend Vincent McNabb, an influential Catholic priest and proponent of the economic theory of distributism, which is related to Guild socialism, but I won't bore you with that tonight. Acting on McNabb and Penty's ideas, Gill founded the Guild of St. Dominic and St. Joseph at Ditchling. In his public announcement regarding the Guild, Gill stated, quote, "The Guild of St. Joseph and Dominic is a craft guild, but it is not primarily a craft guild. It is primarily a religious fraternity for those who make things with their hands," unquote. The Guild's constitution held that, quote, "All work is ordained to God and should be divine worship. The Guild therefore aims at making the goodness of the thing to be made the immediate concern in the work," unquote. The Dominican order's symbol is a hound running with a torch between its jaws. This is the hound of God running down truth. Gill felt the Dominican order was the right fit for his guild because their focus was the affirmation of what they saw as the true nature of humanity. Gill's quest for an all-encompassing religious transformation is very much evident at the same time he founds the Guild. In a letter to his best friend Desmond Shute, he wrote, "A revolution is coming. I try to meet it, 1, by living or learning to live as much as possible on my own resources as a small landed proprietor, and 2, by doing what I can to propagate the faith so that the revolution may be guided in a direction consonant with the fundamental facts of human nature and man's essential perfection. It is a forlorn hope, but not one nearly so forlorn as reform by parliamentary legislation, civic arts association, design and industry, arts league and service, and so forth. Such things merely whitewash sepulchres," unquote. To develop his vision of a revolution that would cut deeply enough to bring real change, Gill blended Penty's research with Kumar Swami's insistence that each man is an artist, and drew on the ideas of Ruskin to affirm the deep dignity and sacred place of creative labor. However, it was Jacques Maritain who gave him the theologically based metaphysical fundamentals to support his view. In Maritain's words, quote, "When work becomes inhuman or subhuman, because its artistic character is effaced and matter gains the upper hand over men, it's natural that a civilization tends to communism and to a productivism forgetful of the true ends of a human being." Theologically speaking, then, post-industrialists such as Gillen Penty held that the ultimate goal or true end of a human being is to contemplate God. Therefore, creative activity should serve as a vehicle to worship God. Gill's Ditchling experiment attempted to enact this belief. Eschewing politics as superficial, he sought to build up his own, quote, "cell of good living in the chaos of our world," unquote. A cell in which workdays were punctuated with prayer, apprentices were trained, and artworks were made for their self-intrinsic spiritual value, rather than as commercial products. In the last year of his life, Gill wrote, quote, "I am sure that all attempts to create cells of the good life in the form of small communities are not only much to be encouraged, but are the only hope." So it was Father McNabb, this Catholic priest that was around when Gill converted and founded the Guild, who introduced Gill to the work of Jacques Maritain. Maritain's Art and Scholasticism was an inventory of the medieval theory of art. As there were no treatises written on art in the Middle Ages, Maritain combed through the work of medieval theologian philosophers known as the scholastics, or schoolmen. The 13th century Dominican monk, St. Thomas Aquinas, was chief among them. While the Guild socialists critiqued present-day economics, it was Maritain, drawing on Aquinas, who propagated the metaphysical foundation, the truth behind all things, on which post-industrial Anglo-Catholics wished to base society. The following passage from Aquinas, quoted in Maritain's book, is central to the Catholic post-industrialist view. Quote, "This also contemplation, all other human operations seem to be ordered, and as to an end, for the soundness of body is required to make contemplation perfect, and to soundness of body are ordered all the artificial necessaries of life. Tranquility also is required from the perturbations of the passions, and this is attained through the moral virtues and prudence. Peace, too, from exterior passions, and to this whole regime of civil life is ordered, so that all human functions, rightly considered, seem to be for the service as such as contemplate truth." So again, that's Aquinas in the 1200s being quoted by Maritain in the 1920s. Maritain's text, delving deeply into medieval thought, provided a touchstone for Gil and his circle. The first English language edition of Maritain's Art and Scholastique was published by Gills Press, as I mentioned. Gill wrote the introduction, calling it, quote, "a cooling word for the overheated modern world," unquote. And the book became the topic of daily conversation and debate at the Guild of St. Joseph and St. Dominic. Maritain's book held that art was a virtue of the intellect, based on his examination of the distinctions between making and doing. Making is governed by materiality. Doing is governed by ethics. Bringing a material work to completion requires reason and technical skill, or art, whereas acting justly requires prudence. Art, then, is the virtue of making, and prudence is the virtue of doing. Because art is achieved through reason, it is uniquely human, and the cultivation of skill in art is the cultivation of a habit of mind and therefore becomes its own prudent activity. Maritain, like Gil, defined art broadly. It encompassed the entire realm of human making, from knitting to painting altarpieces. This was not a new idea to Gil. Indeed, it had been the key to the arts and crafts movement, of which he was an inheritor. Gill's teacher in lettering, himself a student of William Morris, quipped that art, quote, "is the evidence of a workman's joy in his work. Art should not be looked on as enjoyment and luxury to the buyer, but as life and breath to the maker," and extend the idea to cover everything of quality and goodness in things made by hands, unquote. Through his writing on the nature of Christian art, which he argued could just as likely be present in the dance hall as the cathedral, Maritain's thought softened Gil's religious zeal while offering him the absolutes he sought. For example, on a 1926 trip to France to consider the purchase of a summer home, Gil visited the Folies Bergère with his friend Robert Gibbons to see Josephine Baker dance. They then went to a sex club, attended Mass the next day, and then he visited Maritain at the Catholic Institute. Quote, "In my mind," Gil wrote, "a consciously religious attitude of mind in the artist and religious subjects become less and less necessary. The notion is that man as artist is collaborating with God in creating, as a channel for God's creative power." Now, I'm aware of the time and I want to get to the art, so I'm going to skip over a little bit here. There was this book here that Gil wrote, Art and Prudence. If you could hear that art and prudence were kind of the key terms in the Maritain work. Gil's work, Art and Prudence, then is this thing that he's been wrestling with Maritain for over a decade, and puts out this little book to try and kind of solidify his thought and promote this type of thinking. So Gil produced this book, let's see. So Robert Gibbons, this is the publisher at the Golden Cockerel who invited Gil to contribute. Gil and he both founded the Wood Engravers Society in 1920. And wood engraving had become kind of a representative of the resistance to industrial and commercial production. It's handmade, and the difference between a wood engraving and a wood block is cut onto the grain. So the grain of this block of wood goes from top to bottom on this carving, whereas a wood engraving is done on the grain end here, so you can have much finer detail. And so wood engraving is the way that you could incorporate images in hand-printed textual works of text. So here we see a picture of the Golden Cockerel in the Times in 1929, and it was a highly renowned press. And Gibbons wasn't Catholic himself, so Gil resisted working with him for a while, but when he found out he was a nudist, he jumped on board. The two became best friends and colleagues. So I want to, let's see. All right. So let's jump right into this image. So Gil and Gibbons worked together at the Golden Cockerel, and Gil would illustrate works by other, texts by other authors. Sometimes they would make their own text, so that Art and Prudence by Gil was published at Golden Cockerel. So they're writing their own work, but they're also kind of making ends meet by adding engravings to other people's work. But they start to really get ambitious. So they take on the Canterbury Tales, which of course William Morris did at his Kelmscott press. And so they were starting to try and really make it in the rare book world. And so here's some pages from the Canterbury Tales from 1927, where they're really trying to make something similar to a medieval illuminated manuscript. You see with the decorated borders and the foliated pages. But Gil was unsatisfied with the lack of integration between the letters and the images in this work. So in the Golden Cockerel Gospels, when they took on the Gospel book, he undertook to illuminate or decorate the entire word for the beginnings of various pages and episodes. So there's over 80 of these in the Gospel book. And because Gil and Gibbons were working together side by side in this craftsman guild type mode, the Gospel book, the artist and the publisher worked so closely together that every single image in this book is unique in its dimensions and falls differently on each page. So instead of kind of, okay, here's text, we'll hold a page, here's the image, and on you go, the two are deeply integrated. So that's another example. So what I'm talking about now is evidence of these convictions that I've laid out of Gil, that they're evident in the handmade paper, the hand-pulled press, the working relationship between Gil and Gibbons. And even at this point, Gil is really ascendant, and he's doing a carving for the BBC and whatnot, but he still only charged a craftsman's wages to Gibbons. He never kind of capitalized on his name or his reputation. So you can see here there's three versions of the word now, three versions of the word then. And what I'll end with is this idea, this piece here that is the prologue to John. So the first few verses of the Gospel of John, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God." This passage describes Jesus as the Logos, which is translated to the word or utterance of God. In verse 14, the evangelist goes on to say that the Word became flesh, which is to say Jesus is the utterance or expression of God, who is Spirit made materially manifest. This passage is the key to the Christian theology of sacramentalism and is how Christian artists get around the Old Testament prohibition against graven images. Maritain would later quote Gil in his 1955 work, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. Gil said, "What is art? a word made flesh. So we see here this image of the resurrected Jesus. We have the wounds from the crucifixion. He's draped in this robe, and this Latin on this crossbar of the N is from Isaiah 63. Who is this that comes, coming from Edom, from Bozrah, with his garments stained crimson? Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength? It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. And so what we have here is Christ coming, and there's a historiation. I didn't get into this, but the juxtaposition of two images from different parts of the Bible or different texts. So you have an Old Testament verse, you have a reference to Genesis with the creeping things, the story of creation. There's that great phrase in the King James Version of he made all the creeping things on the earth. And then you have Adam and Eve here. And you have Gil exploring these conventions. He's wanting to make this new visual vocabulary so that everyone can access these stories. So you have the tree of life. You can recognize that from the Canterbury Tales, this type of foliation. And then you have these thorns or tares from the Garden of Eden representing the fall of mankind. There's also things like the three circles, the rainbow, this arc here and this arc here. That's a Trinitarian composition. These three circles intersecting decorates, proliferates all around Christian churches. So in conclusion, and I apologize for jumping ahead, I would like to say then that the four Gospels may be seen as a work that is begotten of the marriage of art and prudence. As regards art, it is an object well made for its own good, being born of skill and of knowledge of materials, with qualities such as legibility and clarity being chief, since any book's purpose is that of learning. As regards prudence, the revival and propagation of Christianity was deemed prudent by the post-industrialists, who saw the need to return to first principles. Gil blended Penty's research with Coomaraswamy's insistence that each man is an artist, and drew on Ruskin to affirm the deep dignity and sacred place of creative labor. When we look at this image and look at the Guild statutes, we can now grasp that this object is both modern and a religious work of art. My deeper thesis here is that art, theology, and spirituality are deeply related, and that any art history of the 20th and 21st century that denies how these factors impact the creation of a work is incomplete. The theological power of art is what gives our lives emotional shape. When we relinquish our visual literacy as a society, we lay ourselves open to being emotionally and spiritually formed willy-nilly by whatever gets the most screen time with us. This is important because it illuminates how market-driven aesthetics shapes our emotional and spiritual lives, even if it doesn't claim to do so. And I would argue that we must be aware of these dynamics to be in control of our societal health. Thank you.
What a wonderful and rich presentation. I'm thinking back to your slide of the medieval art, the pillars, and you explained how the carving on every single one was different. And I think your presentation was a little bit like that, right? Every slide was unique and distinct and really rich. So thank you for that. There's a lot to hold in one's mind, and certainly this interwar period is fascinating. We have a lot of people in the room who are more qualified than me probably to ask really good questions. So have a think. If someone wants to get going, we can do that. We also have an opportunity for folks online if they want to send a question to Rachel into the chat. Perhaps while people are thinking about that, I'd be interested on how you came to this. So was the angle, because you're an MA, but predominantly interested in art history. Was it the art that drew you to the politics, or was it the politics that drew you to the art, or how did you come to this?
Thank you. That's a great question. So intuitively and experientially, I've spent time teaching. What do I want to say? I want to say that in my life story, I have experienced how art can be healing. And I've then gone on to teach art, both art history and art literacy, as well as drawing and art making. And I've witnessed that in the classroom, even in a secular, I teach at the Vancouver Island School of Art. It's not a religious institution by any means, but I've noticed the healing that happens when people learn about artistic traditions. When you tell them the difference between, for instance, a pomegranate and a cherry in an altarpiece, that one thing means this and the other, people get so excited. And so I've been looking in my art history, I've been looking for kind of role models or evidence to affirm this idea of the spiritual connection between art and spirituality. And then there's this element too of the Anglo-Catholics, which affirm that materiality is good, right? And so I was raised in the Protestant tradition, and there's a lot of orange shag carpets, and I don't know, a lot of, digital slides for the worship songs. And then I was exposed to the Anglo-Catholic tradition, where there's no screens in worship. There's this idea of worship in the beauty of holiness. So I'm outing myself and committing perhaps what Elkins calls epistemic disobedience by saying it's my own participation in the Anglo-Catholic tradition that introduced me to this and makes me more curious about how it links in. And when I realized it has this, Penty is incredible to read and writes extensively about economics, even though he's a self-trained, apprenticed architect. So they saw it as all completely intertwined, the sacred, the economic, and the art.
Thank you. Paige.
Thanks, Jessica. That was interesting. This is so outside of my wheelhouse, so my question is not going to be particularly sophisticated. I'm wondering, the word crafts brings up a funny connotation. I think we see it as less than art. And so when you talk about arts and crafts of the time, what was their kind of social position? Were they seen, were they revered? Did they make a good living? Were people willing to pay good money? And how has that maybe changed now?
Thanks for the question, Paige. Well, in the 19th century, William Morris famously, with the arts and crafts movement, kind of set about making, you might be familiar with the William Morris wallpapers and the prints and all these other bespoke kind of craft founded, handmade, living wage paid to the worker kind of thing. And it failed, and ultimately because only rich people could afford the stuff. And so Gil was really unsatisfied with the arts and crafts movement. But at the end, he's making this gospel book and selling to an elite audience of collectors. So there's I don't know if there's been a wholesale change, but I would say that this interest in handmade things and craft, part of what I'm trying to, my larger thesis is this idea that art history of the 20th century has excluded theology and spiritual concerns. And one of those things that was also excluded then was this idea of, one of the things that was also operating there was this idea of high art and low art. And so religious art and craft don't make the cut in the modernist canon. And so this work, this gospel book, kind of refutes that idea. This is totally modern. I didn't get to it, but here we have, I mentioned him seeing Josephine Baker, but here's Salome dancing before Herod, and she is Josephine Baker. So I'm drifting and not answering your question, but he's a man of his time. They're people of their time, but they're also saying we need to affirm that people on the that everyone has something to contribute and they can worship God with their bodies, even if they're washing dishes or knitting, and someone on an assembly line is totally robbed of that.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, they would also reject this idea of the artist as being a high-end kind of special person. They wanted to say, we're all artists. Jesus is the ultimate artist. We're made in God's image. So therefore, we're all creative.
Thank you for that question, in part so that we could see this.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have wanted to miss that particular slide. Rachel's a question, and then we'll go to Fran.
Yeah, so there's a question from Catherine Harding, and Catherine says, thank you, a wonderful paper. My understanding of visual theology is that there is a coming together of image and word. Can you say more about the relationship between scripture and image in Gill's art production?
Thank you, Catherine. She's hitting on the thing that I constantly wanting to get to, and I get bogged down in the background. And so, yeah, this idea, that's why this image is so important to me in my research here, that Jesus is the Word made flesh. And Gil says, what is art? A word made flesh. And so in terms of visual theology, what do I want to say? I want to say that when you're looking at an image, it's also shaping your worldview, or you're participating in that artist's kind of world building. And so it's not just theology is really a textual discipline, but at the same time, it's highly visual. Francis can probably speak to this better than I can, but that visual imagery is constantly evoked in theological texts to help explain the theology. So in Coffee Talk today, we were talking about religious behaviors and religious beliefs, and this idea that religious belief might come first and then religious behavior after. But there's also an idea that what you pray impacts what you believe, and what you look at will impact what you believe. And so thank you, Catherine. I don't know if that answered your question.
Francis.
Yeah, this isn't actually a question, and it's rather absurd. But I've got a personal connection with Eric Gill.
Oh, do you?
When I was a student, I lived in a farmhouse in the street near Ditchling, which was owned by, I think it was Eric Gill's son-in-law.
Okay, yes.
And he was a sculptor.
Yes.
I forget his name. I've been racking my brains.
Yes. It would have been his oldest daughter, Betty, and her
No,
husband.
it was Myrtle.
Pardon? Myrtle was the...
Was his wife. Yeah.
Okay, so then maybe the next generation then.
Maybe
Yeah.
the next generation. Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was Renee Haig was the son-in-law, and Dennis Tegetmeyer, and the third, probably the important one is escaping me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very familiar in a way.
Yeah.
We could have renamed your talk something about the complexities of religious artistic men, right?
Yeah.
There was all these little
Yeah.
interesting parts of your story. Rachel.
That's maybe a good leeway into this next question, which is from Arfing Graham. And they asked, did any of the more controversial aspects of Eric Gill's personal life inform any of your research or your conclusions?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing that I don't want to dance around. I'm kind of eager to talk about these things. And most of the last 2 years have been about working through kind of how can I, in good conscience, even study someone like Gil, who would, in our day and age, definitely be canceled. I mean, he engaged in criminal sexual behaviors. And as I said, so it's weird. There's things that I kind of sometimes think it might be inappropriate to develop a sort of gallows humor around working with Gil. And then on the other hand, I'm not sure. There's another Salome, I haven't shown it, but there's another version of Salome, and she has pubic hair showing out from under her dress. So there's things where Gil is, a lot of his biographers write about how he's kind of slippery and indulgent. So he was very vociferous in his writing and his letters and his Catholicism. And then he'll just let it go and do something really weird and silly. And often in his artwork, you can see it. So he did a Song of Songs where, there's images of copulation happening. And he had this whole idea of sex between the bride and Christ, like the church and Christ, and that he got really literal and kind of graphic about. But what I see in the gospel, and I don't want to become an apologist for Gil either, but what I see in the gospel is that somehow he has set aside a lot of those. What I want to say about that Song of Songs is that the art suffers. When he starts to kind of go down that path, the drawing falls apart and becomes very simplistic. And the gospel this project seems to have been strong enough that he hit a balance and was able to produce something that's not continually interrupted by his weird proclivities.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Question, please.
Thanks for a great talk and for great research. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow morning to go further. I've always been impressed by the art of William Blake, who's about 100 years before Gil. And I wonder, was Gil, although some of this is almost joyful, was he a tortured person? Was he Blakean? Was he dark?
Well, certainly his biography is dark. For people studying him, there's things that are really difficult to spend time with. But the priest who served him his last rites said it was the best death he had ever witnessed in his 45 years of ministry. So there's something that Gil found some sort of resolution at some point. But he writes in his earlier life about converting to Catholicism because it might actually put some boundaries on him because he struggled with his own impulses. And I just want to go back to that. There's two things. First of all, William Blake also is a huge influence here, and it's actually William Blake, and I'm indebted to Naomi Billingsley here, it was Blake who talked about Jesus as an artist, the ultimate artist. And so this is something that is really strong in British Romanticism, and again, cries out for a theological element to the art history here. The other thing I wanted to say about Gil in terms of his sexual deviance or his behavior is that this is a debate that's happening in the footnotes of Gil research right now. Every person writing on Gil will say, either distance themselves from him or say, we're destroying the interest in his work if we talk too much about the sex. And I am thinking, one of the conclusions that I've come to or thinking about is that this was a phallocratic culture. And what if Gil was not an exception, but kind of part of the whole package of studying Catholicism and British Romanticism, right? And so that's kind of where I try to say, let's bring this into the conversation instead of canceling Gil. And part of my interest in Maritain and going deeper into that is to say, where was the theological loophole here? What was the heresy, or what was the thing that allowed him to justify his behavior? Because instead of canceling it, let's look at it and diagnose it.
Last question, yeah.
Yeah.
We say, we can acknowledge, we cannot acknowledge, but how to behave in their mind. There's certain, you cannot excuse, but maybe that's not the point of it. Right? You can stay from look at practicing work, and it's a problem that we never go on. Right? But at the same time, say it was wrong about it back then.
Yeah, and he wouldn't have been free.
Jessica, maybe you could summarize. The Zoom audience can't hear the question.
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Babula was saying that we can talk about a phallocratic society or this larger context, but Gil engaged in criminal behavior. And she's saying that that also doesn't mean, though, that looking at his work excuses that behavior. Is that kind of what your point is? That
Trying to figure out whether it's valuable to. Thank you. We can still study his work, even if we admit that it was criminal behavior. He would not have gotten away with that even back then. It's just that his behavior became known later and through unfortunate circumstances because his children spoke out in biographies. That is sort of known to us now. It's not as if our society would not have justified his behavior. It was just plainly criminal back then, just not known. The work itself is fantastic, and that's what every scholar will always have to deal with, right? It's not easy. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a nice place to end. The complexity of the person and the artist and the movement. So let me please join me in thanking Jessica for a wonderful talk. And just before we go, let me just bring to your attention that next week we had to, the person who was supposed to come is not able to come, unfortunately. So there'll be no public lecture next week. But in 2 weeks, we have another one of our fantastic graduate students, Ratan Ali, talking about the impact of religious norms on workplace safety in Cambodia. So it would be great to see you then. Until then, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.